I actually love this question because we've all faced this, and the logic behind it is solid. I mean, anytime we look for training adaptation, we have to have a stimulus that causes that, right? We have to disrupt homeostasis in some way. The whole idea of that which does not kill us makes us stronger. So this should be one of those things, right? And glycogen depletion is effective and it is necessary. It is one of the stimuli for change. It will trigger that adaptation we seek. This, however, I don't think is the best way to go about it. Short answer, is there some positive to it? Yes. Could it be that the body needs bonking? No, it doesn't need to be pushed to those extremes. So briefly, I'd like to just define what a bonk is for those who aren't familiar with this particular nomenclature, or may think they know what a bonk is, but maybe you've never actually been there. And it's more common than you might think. So physiologically, it's a depletion of our muscle glycogen, so the sugar that's stored in the muscle. And I say depletion in quotes if you're watching, because we can't really deplete muscle. I mean, there's still, I think I've seen the lowest levels of muscle glycogen fall to maybe 30%, maybe as low as 20%. And this is actually a trainable thing. And I'll get to why that is trainable in a little while. But it's the idea behind it is that there's a peripheral limitation, peripheral meaning in the muscles. So we're limited by what our muscles can store. When they run out of energy, we can do no more. But just as a brief aside, consider what happens when we truly run out of energy. If there isn't any glycogen in the muscle, if there isn't any ATP available to the muscle fibers, there's one outcome, and it's rigor. I mean, if we don't have ATP to actually release the muscle contraction, we stay in that contracted state. We're clearly not going there. So energy shortage.
Nate kind of shrugged.
Well, honestly, there's an interesting aside to that aside is there's implications with cramping here. So it's got me thinking. It's nothing I want to discuss today because the gears are turning. I haven't got any answers though. So energy shortage limits our capacity for work. It's really that simple. We run out of energy, we can't do more work. And there's a couple models to explain why that is. One of them, and it's I don't know that it's debunked, but it's strongly argued against the catastrophe models of exercise physiology, which some of the criticisms of how we don't come up against this catastrophic muscular failure, and why when we run out of glycogen, we don't just. The reason this doesn't hold up, but two arguments against it are hypoxia. So you go to a high altitude and you can't perform at the same level. That has nothing to do with muscle glycogen. You go out and try to work in heat, especially heat with which you're unfamiliar, high levels of heat, and you experience heat exhaustion, which can push into heat stroke and can get very dangerous. Nothing to do with glycogen. So if glycogen limitation in the muscle is the only threat, how do we explain these things? And if you look at Tim Noakes, and the science on this, or the theory behind this, is quite old, and it's still standing up pretty well. We're talking a good 15 years ago, is that, like I just mentioned, muscle ATP is never reduced below 50% of resting values. I mean, at our worst, we can only push ourselves, according to Noakes, and yes, this is old, maybe has been updated since then, but we can't push ourselves to less than half empty. We simply can't get there. So again, this catastrophe model doesn't hold up. This peripheral limitation model doesn't hold up. And then finally, and this ties it in really well to what Amber was just talking about with her mental game, is that post-bonk, I mean, you can be in a really terrible state, but if it came down to it, you could probably still muster one hard last effort. You could muster a sprint. And on to a lesser degree, what happens when you're out riding and you're in a dark place, but you see the top of the climb, you see the finish line, you see that opponent who has been, your primary motivation start to slip, start to fall off pace, and you recognize, oh, he's hurting. Where does this come from? You don't suddenly have more muscle glycogen available. There's something else going on. When you hear that right song at the right time, you add caffeine into the equation. All these things fly in the face of glycogen being the single limitation. So physiologically,
I was just going to say,
it's not the only.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that, because there have been so many times where I was utterly convinced I had nothing left in the tank after maybe covering a big attack at the end of a race. And I think, okay, that's it. My job's done. And then I see my teammate who's supposed to do the next thing, and she's boxed in, and I'm literally the only person who can do it. Somehow it's there. And it's like, if you had asked me 5 seconds earlier, I would have said there was no way, physically impossible. And yet when it comes down to it, boom, it's there.
It's absolutely possible. Yep. So, and that's a perfect segue into the psychological explanation of what's going on. So the idea here being that the brain subconsciously, it's something we think about, restricts the amount of work that we can do. And it bases this on past experience and future expectations. There's a term called teleoanticipation. Google it. It's interesting stuff. But this boils down to, instead of that peripheral limitation, now we're talking about a central limitation. So now the brain is what's deciding what limits us in terms of what we can and cannot do. So this model states that, or conveys that muscle recruitment is limited. So our brain, we're centrally governed, and hence it's called the central governor model, if they're still using that term. And it does this because it's a protective mechanism. It recognizes what the body has tolerated, it anticipates what the body could tolerate, and then it sets some limits so that we can't exceed these extents. Whether it's physiological and it's in the periphery, whether it's psychological and it's in the brain, it seems to be the consensus, as much as you can have a consensus in a scientific environment, is that it's really just, and this leans more towards the central model, is that it's a combination of afferent feedback, and this is the information that comes from the muscle. So it's the stimulus to the central nervous system, in combination with the efferent, which is the reply or the response from the central nervous system, which can affect the number of muscle fibers recruited, the amount of force developed, the rate of that force development. All of this leans more towards central limitation than peripheral, just what we were talking about. Even though the muscles feel completely spent, even though you're checked out, I can't possibly do more work physically, you can though. You always can.
It's almost like our bodies know that we would make really bad decisions if it was left up to us.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. That's a perfect way to sum it up. Exactly. So yes, the muscles are depleting, and there is the agreement is simply that this depletion isn't the sole shot caller. It's not the one thing. It's not just glycogen depletion. There are too many other things at work. And really, glycogen depletion is almost a oxymoron. But all this in mind, let me just close with this, or close this section. Does it matter? I mean, we run low on glycogen, we hit the wall regardless. So we know this. So it doesn't matter if it's centrally governed. It doesn't matter if it's peripherally managed. The fact is, when we run too low on sugar to unfamiliar depths, our body shuts down, and we don't have really any say in the matter past that point.
I'm going to run some scenarios by you, Chad, and I want you to say bonk or no bonk, so to speak.
Okay.
So start out at the beginning of a crit, and I go, and I've eaten normally, done everything like normal, and I go first lap out hard from the gun in the crit. I don't know who would ever do something like that. Certainly not me. But go hard from the gun, and then 2 or 3 laps later, I blow up. Bonk or no bonk?
Yeah, it's definitely a no bonk. The fuel's still on board. You just push too hard, and I think this is the problem. People throw that term around so often that, I mean, it's kind of a silly term, right? Bonk. It's probably in the dictionary by now, but the fact is, it's not terribly scientific in nature.
Nate, you were going to say something?
You do that almost every crate. Just know if John's racing, almost every time.
He's the king of the 3-lap bonk.
That's it. 3-lap bonk. Yep, that's it. Why not do the dumb move? We'll see. Sometimes it works, huh? Spoken like a smart person. But so along those lines, though, and we'll stop with the bonk, no bonk game, but stretching that out, I think a lot of people, the point I'm trying to make is many times you think you have bonked, but you haven't. It's because you've just outpaced your abilities for a specific time period or something to that degree. Bonking is something that's pretty different. And once again, it's not running yourself entirely depleted of oxygen, but functionally you are depleted. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. And it takes quite a ways to get to that point. And if you have been there, you know, because it's not just fatigue. Like we talked about before, and Amber, I think you mentioned before too. It's like a lack of clarity in your head, and an inability many times to do normal functions, whether that's speaking, whether that's coordination, anything like that. Those things really do start to function or start to fail. I also notice my body rebels, and the very thing it needs, it's going against, and it's telling me, I know that I need to eat and I know that I need to drink. But if I do that, it's like my brain is convinced that it will be just, certain to make it worse. However, that's not the case. I need to take it in. But this is something, at least for me, I've bonked, sure, plenty of times, but I can't think of a single time I've ever bonked with a ride that's been under like 5 hours ever. Like it's always, they're always long rides where I've really rammed myself down for a very long time and done
Same.
way too much and not fueled well. You know, it's not something that just happens on a short ride. So.
Amber, have you ever bonked?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Chad?
It sucks.
Yeah, I was going to close with a couple of examples that let me explain some more things, and then I'll try to tie it all together. So I've described what bonking is, so now that you have, I hope, a better understanding of what happens when we bonk, and use of that term should be limited, or maybe limit it to those actual situations. Let me explain why it's not the best way to go about achieving the adaptation you're looking for, Tom. So the consequences of depleting glycogen, or what's often termed as operating in a low energy state, you just don't have the fuel in the tank, are many. I'll run through, I think I've got maybe 8 or 10 of them here, but the first of which is that there are high levels of cortisol. And this is both during and post exercise. And as you've probably heard, that's a catabolic hormone. So it sounds like it's not a desirable thing, but when in exercise, you're in a catabolic state and cortisol is flowing, it's actually a good thing as long as carbohydrates on board, because we need this cortisol to actually break down the fuel sources. It'll break down fat, it'll break down protein for that matter. So the fact is cortisol helps us fuel the work, and it's going to get its fuel from somewhere. So if we run out of carbohydrate, where's it going to come from? Yes, fat is still a resource, but we're probably going to start to dip into that whole protein metabolism and that unfavorable catabolism that people worry so much about, and rightly so. And this is rarely beneficial. I say rarely because, yeah, maybe there are situations where you do want to metabolize a little bit of upper body mass, for instance. Say you're trying to, become a true T-Rex shaped cyclist and you want to ditch all that upper body mass. Okay, that might be a situation where losing muscle mass is favorable to your performance.
Very desirable aesthetic, that one.
It never looks good. I'm sorry. But muscle is what makes watts, right? And muscle is what burns fat. So if you're sacrificing muscle, well, you're sacrificing power, and you're sacrificing your lipolytic or your fat burning capabilities to some extent. Secondly, there's a decrease in very, very germane, considering the situation right now, is there's a decrease in immunosuppression. So we basically increase our susceptibility to illness and infections. And this lasts for quite a long time. I mean, we're talking 24 to 72 hours post, depending on the depth of the hole you dig. David Nyman recently came to the forefront of, I can't remember what magazine it was in. I think Runner's World or something, but he's an exercise physiologist, and he didn't coin the term, but he cited the term immunometabolism, in that our immunity is tied to metabolism in certain ways. And he sees this, or it is a carbohydrate centric school of thought, in that carbohydrate is necessary for us to maintain high levels of immunity. And if you think about it, immune cells can actually bonk. They're cells like anything else. They do require sugar to function. And if we deplete them of sugar, well, they can't function. So this is why our immune system takes a hit. And this is tied to a couple things in particular, and they're the usual culprits: duration and intensity. So if you're doing long work, you have to be cognizant of the fact that you are repressing or suppressing your immune system. So, address your long rides carefully. Recognize that you probably shouldn't go shaking any hands. I mean, in any circumstances, certainly not these. And then intensity. But the interesting thing about intensity is that you can really run your immune response down with long, hard efforts, long, high intense efforts. But if you break those efforts up with recoveries, it has a huge impact on your immune response. In that, if you work short, take a break, work short, even at really high intensity, you don't take that same immunosuppressive hit. And he worked with, in this case, marathon runners who would actually either run the aid station or walk the aid stations, or take 1-minute walking breaks every mile. I think that's what they did. But the fact is, what they saw in terms of their immune response at the end of the marathon was very different than what the people who gutted out the entire 26.2 miles. Thirdly, so severe depletion of glycogen stores usually comes at the cost of a really slow return to training readiness. Another term for that is training disruption. You're basically pushing on yourself a disruption in your training. It's self-imposed. So there's really no good excuse for that. On top of that, you're going to impact both the timing, because you're probably going to have to push it out, and the quality of the subsequent workouts. When you do finally get back on the bike and you try to do that first high quality workout, I bet you anything, the quality is just not going to be where it would be if you had fueled well. We can all speak to that.
confirm.
Yes,
Yeah, totally.
100%. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Fourthly, there's a threat of dehydration, and that rises with glycogen depletion, because glycogen packs quite a lot of water. And if you're drinking plain water the whole time, I mean, then your performance decreases. So maybe not a big threat, but it does question or call into question the reasoning behind the workout. It affects the quality of it. And on that note, sodium depletion takes place, and I can't think of a situation where sodium depletion is beneficial. So should you engage in water rides, which is actually a good way to approach improving some of the things that you're after, Tom, do include electrolytes, especially if they're on hot rides and rides with low cooling, low wind.
Mm-hmm.
Fifthly, and from a performance perspective, perhaps the most important of all of these is the impact on your work capacity. I mean, we go out there to do these high quality workouts with the intention of lifting our capabilities, eliciting or pushing an appropriate training response or stimulus, based on our current capabilities. We have to push the boundaries, and we can't do that if we're under fueled. If the gas isn't in the tank, we can't drive the car. And then I think this gets overlooked too frequently, is the psychological impact. And I've termed this kind of an associative spiral, in that you start to see these long, hard workouts as, in your case, basically near death experiences. Why would you ever want to do that again? I mean, going into it, you're already halfway talked out of it, because you know how awful this is going to be, and you know how hard the road back is going to be. There's nothing positive psychologically about running yourself to these depths. Mm-hmm. And then one more small bit is that it's dangerous, plain and simple. This was brought up in our planning meeting, but the fact is, if you've ever truly bonked, you understand that this is dangerous. If you're out on the road and you're in a bonking state, anything can happen. You are very much detached from reality at that point. So
yeah, you cannot make good decisions,
dangerous.
let alone react quickly or appropriately.
No,
if you need to.
Literally, the only thing that's ever made sense to me in those circumstances are how much edible, drinkable things can I get in my mouth right now?
Mm-hmm.
That's all I care about. It doesn't matter where I find it or what it is. I will eat or drink anything.
Just to reiterate on this is when you call home. This is when you phone a friend. This is when you do that sort of thing.
Real.
There's no pride in pushing through a bonk. No pride at all. It's only hurting you.
It's not productive from a training standpoint, and you're putting yourself and potentially people around you at risk. So yeah, just not generally a good idea.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, and then finally, let's just look at it. So I've said all these things that are negatives about pushing yourself to this point, but let's look at how we can dial it back just a little bit and actually benefit from what it is you're doing. So in this case, we're kind of looking at the risk to reward, or the cost to benefit ratio. And I consider it extremely questionable when you run it to extremes. I'm not a fan of extremes. I don't think they're productive. So my point here is that there are better and safer ways to do this. And this is probably the take-home message of all of this. You don't need to push it to this extent, Tom. Rather, you can find ways to achieve everything that you're after and do it safely and far more productively. So glycogen depletion is in fact a stimulus for increasing our ability to store glycogen. So, we deplete, and our physiologic response is to allow more storage. But you don't have to bonk to do this. Endurance training by nature does this. Amber?
And there's just a huge difference between glycogen depletion and bonking. So you can do this in a controlled space. It's a matter of degrees, right? Like you can deplete glycogen somewhat, so you're not in that altered mental state where you're really at risk. And that's a different stimulus, and that's a different approach than bonking, where you've depleted yourself so much that now you're essentially useless. Like you're not going to get training benefit. You're not able to make decisions or do anything safely. So I just want to kind of clarify that there's a matter of degree here. And when we say glycogen depletion, it doesn't necessarily mean all the way depleting to the point of bonking.
Yeah, exactly. Degrees of depletion. And also the absence of glycogen or glucose in the bloodstream can in fact lead to greater fat oxidation, but so do so many other things. And they do this by using exactly what Amber just talked about, degrees of depletion. There's long, slow distance. There's low carbohydrate or water rides, ideally with electrolytes at low intensity. There's we've talked about restricting your carbohydrate intake after the ride. In certain circumstances, that can be more beneficial than detrimental. Low intensity work without on-the-fly sugar. So if you get on the bike in the morning to do pedit for your umpteenth time, probably don't need to take a gel to get through pedit in most circumstances, especially if you're concerned with improving your lipolytic or fat burning capabilities, especially if you're concerned with shedding a little more fat. Also, consider what happens when you do hit that wall and you have to hobble home at 30 or 40% of threshold. It becomes a survival ride, and the productivity of that, even from a fat burning perspective, pales in comparison to having just a little bit of sugar left in the muscles, such that you can ride at 50 or 60% and burn that many more grams of fat per hour during those waiting minutes or hours of your ride. And then I hesitate to throw this in there, but I will because it's talked about so often. There's that notion of fat burning in a carbohydrate flame. And honestly, I started digging into the bioenergetics of this again, and I lost interest like I always do because it's almost irrelevant. So maybe I could make sense of it. Maybe there is something to it. I honestly can't speak to that. Maybe you can, Amber, but it almost is beside the point. I'm already convinced sugar is a necessary factor or a necessary component in proper endurance training and performance. And then there's also the context too. If you're super focused on fat oxidation and you're trying to go about it through all these extreme measures, in the case of bonking, at the extreme end of things, the science doesn't really support this notion. And I'm looking at you, ketosis or ketogenic diet, because yes, you have this high fatty acid oxidation, but there's super limited applications where that truly is beneficial to performance. This is that whole notion of some is good, so more must be better. But when it comes to us, we have to keep context in mind. Also, we're not the sort of athletes who go out and plod along for hours on end at 60%. Rather, we need to be metabolically flexible. We need to be able to utilize carbohydrate. We need to be able to rely on fat, and we need to be able to vacillate between these two freely. Mm-hmm. And then finally, and this is it, I promise. When we talked about this with our what's our new podcast called, Nate?
Science of Getting Faster.
Science of Getting Faster. Yes. Research does in fact have its limitations. You do have to recognize that lab findings don't always translate or align with real world performance. So what they can replicate in a lab may not be replicable in a race or even outdoors, not as tidily anyway. And that the mechanism doesn't always link to performance. And again, fat adaptation is a perfect example of this. We get really good at oxidizing fat, but does this help us go faster as a road racer or even a time trialist or a criterium racer? Does it help us get on the podium?
Amber, you had a really good way of like writing this down from like a clear kind of, it's a great analogy. Could you say that one for us?
Yeah. When I read this question, what I was thinking in my head was, does your car need to run down to empty to build resistance to operating with no gas? Yes. How often should I run my car down to empty? Like, to me, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
It's a useful translation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to recap a bit on a lot of that, sure, there are some benefits that can come from running yourself into a depleted state of varying degrees and depleted state of different things. Reliance on fat and that sort of thing can be helpful depending on it. But if you're really looking at aiming for performance, it does not make sense to intentionally run yourself out of carbohydrates. Right, Chad?
Well,
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think it's important to just step back real quick and just say, we're looking at this from the performance perspective, right? Like there are really, really constructive applications for a ketogenic diet, for other applications, for other lifestyles, for other situations and issues. But when we're talking about trying to get faster on the bike and chasing that performance goal, trying to get on the podium, racing, this is the perspective that we're taking on this. So we're by no means bashing on any particular diet. And yes, we are big fans of carbohydrate, but again, this is from a very specific context we want to get faster.
Yeah, full disclosure, I'm a big proponent of fat adaptation, high fat diets, low carbohydrate, high fat, all that. But again, it's contextual. As an endurance athlete, especially an endurance athlete who has to have high glycolytic or sugar burning capabilities, it's not a good fit.
Right.
Going-
And if as in this question, if you're talking about, you want to get stronger and faster on the bike, and this is the context in which you're bonking, the bonking itself is probably not going to be super useful toward those ends.
Doesn't need to be taken to those extremes. Simply doesn't.
Right.
Right. The root of Tom's question really is, how do I, is bonking beneficial? So we've covered that, but he also mentioned that he doesn't know why, and it happens from time to time. So perhaps we can also send some suggestions on how to avoid that. Any things that we've done. Nate, I think that you put down a tip on here to set a timer to help with fueling.
This is what triathletes do. Is your Garmin, you can set a timer. So after so many minutes, it beeps and just tells you to eat. It's super easy because you can forget in a race, especially mountain biking too. It's a lot harder to remember eating. Two, I want to say, someone said in the chat, but I personally think I've never bonked for real. I've been dehydrated, and dehydrated, you get kind of the same feeling, or you get and then you get too hot. That happened to Carson City and Leadville, where I didn't have enough water and just dehydrated. And you might think because your watts went down a whole bunch that it was a bonk, but you might have just not had enough water in your system.
Yeah, heat exhaustion, dehydration, these can feel pretty similar.
It's also, I don't know this, but at least in my scenario, it would be pretty rare that I bonked, but then also wasn't in some sort of high risk situation to become dehydrated as well, right? Like in many cases, you're out there for a long time. Chances are you aren't fueling properly. If you aren't fueling properly, chances are you're probably not drinking properly.
So it's a cool day though. And the
fact that all these characteristics carry over from heat exhaustion to dehydration to improper nutrition or low glycogen just reinforces the whole mental aspect of this, the whole central governance of it. It's being controlled elsewhere. It doesn't really matter what's bringing us to this point where the body or the brain needs to intervene. We're getting there because we're in a threatened state.
Mm-hmm. And Nate, as you were mentioning there, on like a cold day, you sweat less, you probably need to drink less. But at the same time, I think that many times when it's a cold day, most of us drink way less and probably a little too little.
I was going to say, there are riders who want to do, there's a badge of courage of doing 100 miles on just water and salt. And in that situation, if you're drinking a bottle every hour, it's 55 degrees, you're probably not dehydrated and you could experience a real bonk. But I'm assuming you would, I think a real bonk's way worse than dehydration. And sometimes dehydration can end in a cramp too, which is bad, but not as bad as from what you guys are describing, a real carbohydrate bonk.
And I think it's worth mentioning the nausea component of this too. So I've definitely been in situations where I'll finish a race, for example, and I'll be very depleted. Like I won't necessarily have bonked, but I'll be very depleted and my stomach is not happy. And it took me a while to figure this out, but when I get to that point, if I can get some fuel on board, especially with liquid, that actually cures the nausea. But it's really, really uncomfortable because the nausea is making you feel like the last thing you want to do is put anything on your stomach. And usually in those cases, solid foods are more difficult to get down than something liquid. But if you can just get some liquid calories into your system, often the case is that's like the perfect solution. It will actually cure the nausea. So if you can just keep that small little rational part of your brain online at those moments and convince yourself that, okay, I know this feels like a horrible decision to make because I just feel awful right now. Sometimes that's exactly the thing that you need to just feel 10 times better.
One other tip to avoid bonking is to figure out your consumption rate of carbohydrate and figure out where you can kind of sit, and then just always know that that's the plan. So for your race, for your training ride, for whatever ride you're doing, just know that if you normally have to take in 60, 70, 80, 90, whatever grams of carbohydrate an hour, make sure that you have everything to be able to do that. And then a good goal is to know that halfway point, I should have drank this much. Where am I at? Or hour by hour, I should have drank or eaten this much. Where am I at?
Yeah. I like to do that hour by hour, and I'll put, a certain number of, I like gels. I know a lot of people aren't fans of gels, but gels or chews or chomps or whatever that are in your pocket. And I'll know I need to empty this pocket by, this pocket should be empty 2 hours in or whatever it is. And when to your point, if you plan that and you make those decisions before you get on the bike, those are decisions you don't have to make on the bike. And that helps a lot because then it's not decision making. It's just, now you're just executing. You're just executing. And that reduces the cognitive load and it can make it a lot easier to just abide by a nutritional plan.
It's too late to make good decisions on the bike or to trust yourself with good decision making because you know that you'll be in a compromised state. So you have to make those decisions beforehand. Yeah,
definitely.
Absolutely. One other thing too that can help with bonking is, like Nate said, setting a timer. If you don't have a timer, or for some reason you don't want to do that, have your friend be your timer or your reminder. And this has been really helpful for me when I first started riding out. And he actually used to work for TrainerRoad, but a really fast mountain biker named Trevor. We used to do these really big, long rides, and he sucked at eating. I sucked at eating, but both of us, we got to the point where we would be like, have you eaten that yet? Have you eaten that yet? And we were, that was, it's really helpful. And just, you need another perspective, because the fact is, many times when you're on the bike, you are not going to want to eat when you should be eating. But you have to look at it when you're fueling the performance on the bike. You have to look at it as a relationship of, there's a fire burning and I need to put fuel on that fire. If I don't, then it does start to go down.
And it's signaling to your brain, because we talked about the central governor theory as well. You need to convince your brain that it's okay to keep writing checks. And sometimes it's less about the calorie intake and more about just the taste of carbohydrate, that sweet flavor in your mouth that's signaling to your brain that you've got fuel coming in. And then it's just convincing your brain that it's cool, we got this.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly.
If you like that video, you should subscribe to our channel. There's more where that came from. And even like the video down below with a thumbs up, or leave us a comment.
If you want to see race analysis videos, click right over here. And if you want to get your coaching questions answered, click over here.
And if you want to become a faster cyclist, head over to TrainerRoad.com. It works. Trust us.
Just trust us.
We guarantee it.
Oh yeah, or your money back.
It's true. Take us up on it.